Today's notes are titled A More Perfect Union. This is Unit 1, Notes number 4. So the war becomes a symbol of liberty. In September of 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. This ended the American Revolution and granted American independence from Britain. So I just kind of fast forwarded over the war because there's lots of battles that are fought. And so the battles are not so much the most important part. I feel it's the causes and then what happens after that kind of we really need to focus on, especially because you guys got the revolution in eighth grade. So the war happened, it's over. Now America has independence. What are they now going to do with that? So the American Revolution would inspire the world as both a democratic revolution and a war for independence. So we'll see the French, they become kind of inspired by the American Revolution. Their own revolution will start in 1789. And we'll see other revolutions in Europe kind of become motivated by our revolution. During the war, class distinctions began to blur. So you have an army and you have men that are rich and men that are poor, and they're all kind of being treated the same way. So it kind of begins to stimulate a rise in the idea of egalitarianism, the belief in the equality of all people. So the challenge of creating a government. So now America's independent, we need a government. Americans had rejected the British system of government. So we didn't want a king, we didn't want a monarchy, we didn't like the way that that system was run. And so when we set out to create our new government, we're kind of doing the complete opposite of what they did. So our founders set out to build a stable republic, a government of the people. The Continental Congress set to create a new order of the ages. So some of the complex questions that they would need to be addressed would be who should participate in government? You know, who's going to vote? Who's going to hold political office? How should the government answer to the people? How could a government be set up so that opposing groups of citizens would all have a voice? And so these, again, are very complex questions. Do they have answers? We will see. So the Confederation encounters problems. Congress proposed a new type of government in a set of laws called the Articles of Confederation. So this is essentially our first constitution. The Confederation encountered overwhelming problems in dealing with immediate issues. These problems range from economic issues such as taxation and the national debt to political issues such as the nature of congressional representation. You know, should larger states with bigger populations have more representation than smaller states? But yet, is that fair because they're both states? So there were a lot of issues. Americans' fear of giving the national government too much power had resulted in a government that lacked sufficient power to deal with the nation's problems. And this is a direct result of what we saw with Britain. We didn't want a monarch. We didn't want one ruler making decisions. We wanted something different. So the Constitutional Convention would change all of this. So let's stop and think. What were the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? So the Articles of Confederation is our first constitution. It is in place for about like 6 years before the Continental Congress realizes we need to make some changes. So some of the major weaknesses, Congress could not enact or collect taxes. If you can't collect taxes, how are you going to pay for your army? How are you going to pay for road development, for anything that the country wants to do? That's a huge dilemma, huge obstacle. But because they had been so overtaxed by the British, they didn't want any taxes, but taxes are necessary. Let's see, other weaknesses. Congress could not regulate interstate or foreign trade. Excuse me. They needed a 2/3 majority to pass any law. Articles could only be amended if all of the states had approved. And so there were With this Articles of Confederation, there were 13 separate states that lacked national unity. So all the states wanted to keep their own independence and be separate. So like even states, their money, Rhode Island had different type of money than New York or Pennsylvania. So there wasn't a lot of connection amongst the states. So some key conflicts of the Constitutional Convention. So in May of 1787, delegates from almost all states met in Philadelphia to review the articles. And initially, they met to try to revise the articles. They just wanted to fix it to make it better. But after a few days, they realized that they needed to start from scratch. So some of the major issues that they would need to review would be strong central government versus strong states. Still at this time, the states wanted their own autonomy. They didn't like the fact that the strong central government had more power over them, or they were unwilling to kind of give up that power. Large states versus small states. How are we going to determine representation? Do we favor states with bigger populations at the expense of our smaller states? Do we make everybody equal because they're all states? That would have to be solved. And then North versus South. There were a lot of differences between the more industrial North and the more agricultural-based South that utilized the forced labor of slaves. And so many of these southern states were fearful that a law may be passed to do away with slavery, and they didn't want that to happen. Created a new government. The new system of government was a form of federalism that divided power between the national government and the state governments. The power granted to the national government by the Constitution are known as delegated powers: control of foreign affairs, providing for national defense, regulating trade, and coining money. The powers kept by the states are called reserved powers, and powers such as providing education, establishing marriage laws, and regulating trade within a state. The delegates protected the rights of the states, but they also granted some powers exclusively to the national government. They created 3 branches of government: the legislative branch that would make laws, the executive branch to carry out the laws, and the judicial branch to interpret the law. So this is known as the separation of powers. They didn't want all of these powers to be held by one branch or one person. They felt that by separating it out, it would help to prevent any type of tyranny from happening within the government. The delegates established a system of checks and balances to prevent one branch from dominating the others. And so I'll give you a few examples of those coming up. So let's stop and think. How did the system of checks and balances work? So checks and balances of the federal system. And so we have the executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch. So an example would be the legislative branch is Congress. So they pass a law, they vote on it, they debate on it. But then in order for that law to go into place, the executive branch, the president, has to sign it and approve it. But then, even if that happens, if the law were to violate the Constitution, the judicial branch checks to make sure that the law is appropriate. And here you have a few more examples of that. So, ratifying the Constitution. After 4 months of debate and compromise, the delegates succeeded in creating a constitution that was flexible enough to last through the centuries to come. The delegates provided a means to change the Constitution through an amendment process. The convention was over, but new government could not become a reality until the voters ratified it. It would be sent to Congress, then to the states for approval. Many Americans were initially shocked by the radical changes that it proposed. Each state would hold a special convention where delegates would vote to accept or reject the Constitution. Ratification would require at least 9 states. So some controversies over the Constitution. Supporters of the Constitution called themselves Federalists because they favored the new balance of power between the states and the national government. Their opponents became known as Anti-Federalists. because they opposed having such a strong central government. Federalists believed that Americans would be protected from tyranny because of the system of checks and balances and the division of power. So they basically saw that the Constitution was perfect as it was. They felt that all the protections were implied in the Constitution, but the Anti-Federalists were fearful that the government would serve the interest of a privileged minority and ignore the rights of a majority. They also felt that the Constitution lacked protection for individual rights. They wanted things to be much more clearly spelled out and defined. Opposing forces. Federalists received heavy support from urban centers where merchants, skilled workers, and laborers saw the benefit. Small states also favored a strong central government that could protect their interests. Anti-Federalists received support from rural areas where people feared a strong government that might add to their already big tax burden. The Federalists was a series of 85 essays defending the Constitution, and this appeared in New York newspapers from 1787 to 1788. And so Alexander Hamilton was one of the few writers of the Federalist essays. And so their goal in writing these essays was to convince people that the Constitution is good. They provided an analysis and an explanation of the new Constitution. So the Bill of Rights leads to ratification. The proposed Constitution contained no guarantee that the government would protect the rights of the people or the states. Anti-Federalists argued that the people needed a national Bill of Rights. They wanted written guarantees that the people would have freedom of speech, of the press, and of religion. Federalists insisted that the Constitution granted only limited powers to the national governments, that it could not violate the rights of the states or the people. In September of 1789, Congress submitted 12 amendments to the state legislatures for ratification. By December of 1791, 3/4 of the state had ratified 10 of the amendments, which became known as the Bill of Rights. The first 8 amendments would spell out personal liberties that the states had requested. The 9th and 10th amendments imposed general limits on the powers of the federal government. And then our assignment for today, we'll look at the Bill of Rights a little bit more, and you guys will have an assignment to explain each of the amendments. So these are the end of the notes. If you have questions, write them down, and we'll talk about them in our Zoom.